Accountability Commission.
Buenas tardes.
Let me just do this again. We're going to call this meeting into order. It is 6:45 on June 30th. This is a public meeting of the City of Portland's Police Accountability Commission. If the
Buenas
Spanish interpreter, yeah, please.
Buenas tardes. Vamos a empezar la reunión. Son las 6:45 de la tarde del 30 de junio. Esta es una reunión pública de la Comisión de Responsabilidad Policíaca. Okay.
And Dr. Moses.
Doctora Moses.
Thank you. The city also offers ASL interpretation, which is being provided by Heather and Amanda. You can pin their video feed if that is helpful to you. Finally, the closed captioning is turned on in Zoom as another means of assistance. Please note that this is an automatic captioning service and it is not always accurate. The city supports access to meetings of the Police Accountability Commission and can provide other language support as well. Please email in advance of future meetings, either as a response to a public meeting notice or directly to police accountability at portlandoregon.gov to ask for other access assistance, including interpretation in other languages. This meeting is a public meeting subject to City of Portland's administrative code and Oregon state law and is being recorded. For this meeting, the chat function is enabled for commissioner members to communicate with each other. Members of the public will be asked to members of the public will be able to ask questions using Zoom's Q&A feature as the commissioners are presenting and discussing things. If attendees have questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A. We hope that this feature will help guide our conversation during the meeting and future meetings and topics. We'd like to be clear that not all questions will be answered during the meeting, but if answered, both question and answer will be visible to you and will become part of the meeting record. To access the feature, just click on the Q&A icon in the middle of your screen.
Thank you so much, Ayomide. I would like to give our land acknowledgement. The purpose of our land acknowledgement is to center the traditional native inhabitants of the land upon which we live. We want to respectfully acknowledge the Chinook, the Clatskanie, the Kalapuya, and the Multnomah and the Clackamas, the two tribal nations who are missing from this map, who are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, because of the genocide that occurred in the creation of this country. We honor those who have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we pay our personal respects to their elders, both past and present. The community agreements are on your screen, and we invite commissioners to read through these, so we will do these silently and give time for you to take a look at each of these agreements. And our second page of agreements. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to pass it over to the co-chairs to discuss the timeline.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Simab Husseini, and I am a co-chair for the fact-finding phase of our mission. The commission is currently expected to go into August. It includes hearing from key stakeholders, identifying barriers to accountability in Portland presently, and examining systems of accountability from other jurisdictions. It also includes increased community engagement work. Future phases of work will develop the parameters for new policy accountability system before the commission presents that to the City Council in 2023 for their consideration and approval. Now, following today's meeting, here are the next several upcoming meetings of the commission. The PAC is, the Police Accountability Commission, is taking a break this coming week and will not have meetings after today until July 11th. The subcommittee on research will meet July 14th and July 25th. The subcommittee on community engagement events will meet July 18th. And the full commission will resume meeting July 11th with the Mental Health Alliance and City Attorney's Office. July 21st with the Albina Minister Alliance Coalition for Justice and Police Reform, as well as City Commissioner Rubio. And July 28th with the Portland Police Association, which is the police union in Portland, as well as City Commissioner Dan Ryan. Now, this next slide is the current project plan for the fact-finding phase of the Police Accountability Commission's work. It's not their agendas and it is updated regularly. This slide is mostly for members of the public to be able to understand how the commission gets from now through the end of the phase, which focuses on identifying areas of agreement among commission members as to barriers to accountability in the current system, best practices from Portland and other jurisdictions, and suggestions to consider from experts, as well as taking public comment and meeting with key stakeholders. Today's meeting is in the blue box near the center of the screen with yellow highlighted text and purple border. Now, today's meeting agenda includes a briefing with Christopher Paye, who is the coordinator for the Police Review Board. He is a non-sworn professional staff member at the Portland Police Bureau. This briefing consists of 3 parts: a presentation on police accountability and the PRB role in the current system, a Q&A period with Police Accountability Commission members and our briefers, and then a public comment and questions period where members of the public can give their opinions and ask questions, or briefers as well. Please note that City Commissioner Dan Ryan was also scheduled for today, but is out sick. His briefing was rescheduled to July 28th. After Mr. Paye's briefing, there'll be a time for the Police Accountability Commission members to discuss all briefings we've heard so far and identify what best practices and barriers to police accountability they feel should go into the Police Accountability Commission's areas of agreement document, which are both the output of this phase of work and the problem statement for what the Police Accountability Commission is going to try and fix in future phases. There will be also an open public comment period at the end of the meeting for community members to discuss anything under the Police Accountability Commission's agenda or give their stories related to policing and police accountability.
You're on mute.
Yep. Thank you so much, Commissioner Simab. Truly appreciate that. We're going to shift gears, and today we are going to show a video. And this video is going to be very grounding to your work that we believe. And so I am going to pull this video up, I hope. Yes, I am. And it's 38 minutes. Please take notes in terms of what new information it brings forward to you, and then we will have a conversation afterwards. So again, I'm going to share my screen, and please feel free to take notes.
White people did not exist before 1681. Again, white people did not exist on planet Earth until 1681. Number two, any claim that this group called white people, any claim that that group is rooted in biology or derived from genes or biology or is innate or is from nature is a lie. Third and final point, as a matter of law, actually, let me say it this way. White supremacy.
I'm sorry, someone says,
We can't see the video, Christine. I'm sorry.
mm,
We can hear it, but all we could see was your desktop.
Yep.
no, you don't want to see my desktop. My desktop is a mess.
A lot of
No.
screenshots. A lot of screenshots.
No.
It's a desktop of a doctor.
There we go. We can see it now.
Oh, thank you so much.
Supremacy has been in. Number two, any claim that this group called white people, any claim that that group is rooted in biology or derived from genes or biology or is innate or is from nature is a lie. Third and final point, as a matter of foundational law, actually, let me say it this way. White supremacy has been embedded in the United States of America from its founding as a matter of law. Now, I don't expect you to buy all that, to get all that, to believe all that, at least not now. But my job is to share with you the legal history that proves each of those three claims that I begin with. So let's go. Let's get started. We have to begin this conversation in colonial North America, specifically in the colonies, the British colonies of Maryland and Virginia. Both were British colonies, and both shared a number of particular characteristics. First, their economies were rooted in tobacco farming. If you know much about tobacco farming, it requires tremendous human labor. Lots and lots of workers. So those who owned large plantations, big landholders, constantly needed laborers to do the work to grow the tobacco. In addition to sharing an economic base, both colonies had an incredible gender imbalance, roughly 10 men for every woman. Now, let's understand a little bit about the folks who constitute the people in these two colonies. Oh, and by the way, let me give you a year. We're in the early 1600s, okay? The early part of the 17th century, colonial North America. England had, for some bizarre reason that today demographers cannot explain, there was a population boom in England in the early 17th century. So there were lots and lots of poor British people who were on the public doles, who couldn't find a way to make a living, who couldn't feed themselves. So the king in England was quite happy to have them sign a contract of indenture to then go work in the British colonies. And that is what happened. Both indentured and enslaved persons, according to historian Edmund Morgan, were sold and traded like cattle. But of course, not all laborers stand equal in terms of their labor agreement or lack thereof. Those who came under a term of indenture worked for a term of years And presumably this indenture was an agreement that they chose to enter into. The terms of indenture were largely protected by British law, although the terms that took form in colonial North America were quite different than those that existed in England. For example, in England, indentured servants could marry because that was viewed as the way to produce the next group of workers. In this country, indentured servants were prohibited from marrying, and if women were unfortunate enough to get pregnant during their term of indenture, they added usually about 7 to 9 years onto their term of indenture and 1 year to the father. Slavery, of course, was a status that came with life, work for life. There was neither British law nor international law to prohibit or restrict slavery. What we do know is that at this time period in colonial North America, there were free persons of African descent. We know that landholders freed slaves. They did so in wills. They did so by allowing them to purchase their own freedom or the freedom of a family member. The vast majority of workers, laborers, in colonial North America at this time were British men, British workers, the vast majority. There were some women, there were some European laborers from Portuguese, Dutch, folks from Ireland and from Scotland are also revealed in the records, but the vast majority were British men. There were small numbers of persons of African descent, and there were even smaller numbers of members of native tribes. But in this slide, I'm trying to capture the socioeconomic ladder, and really that ladder should be about as long as this room. The landholding elite are, in today's parlance, that's the 1%. And the vast majority of folks who were in the colonies were laborers. Again, they were British, other Europeans, Africans, and members of native tribes. Here's what I find folks have the most difficult time with. We tend to really struggle with getting a good picture of social life, the social context at this juncture. We're very good at understanding the social relations that exist later, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But pre-Bacon's Rebellion society is something that we generally in this country struggle to grasp. So I'm going to do my best to paint a broad stroke picture of this time period. What we know is that British and African laborers worked, ate, and slept together. Furthermore, the evidence from this period, which covers the first 3/4 of the 17th century, that the anecdotal evidence reveals that they lived under similar conditions and faced the same opportunities and chances to make it once one was free of their term of service, whether free of enslavement or free of indenture. So let's review this. British laborers constituted the vast majority of the populations in both colonial Maryland and colonial Virginia. All men, of course, because the law of coverture, let me tell you something about that law of coverture. The law of coverture is derived from British common law, and it structures marriage. And this is how Barrister Blackstone famously described the law of coverture. In marriage, the man and the woman become one, and the one is the man. You didn't have the right to retain your own wages. You couldn't create estate planning, wills, or trusts without the approval of a man. So all men who were free of indenture or enslavement faced the same opportunities in these colonies as a matter of law. For example, free men of African descent could own servants or slaves, and they did. They could vote, and they did. They could marry persons of the opposite sex. God, and I love that I have to make that qualification now. Woo! They could marry persons of the opposite sex regardless of national origin, and they did. In fact, marriages between men of African descent and women primarily of British descent were not uncommon at all. In one county, 1/2 of the free men of African descent were married to a European woman. There was a challenge to these marriages, but it did not come from the masses. It came from elites, and that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, this little depiction is meant to be a depiction of the lawmakers in Maryland, colonial Maryland lawmakers. They passed a law in 1664 punishing, and I quote, British and other freeborn women who marry enslaved Negro men. The punishment for entering into these marriages was that the woman herself would be enslaved for her husband's life, and any children they have would be enslaved into their 20s. Now imagine that you are a plantation owner. That's not a bad deal. I get more property. I like that. And that is exactly what happened. Rather than deter these marriages, which is the express intent of the law of 1664, rather than deter them, these marriages were encouraged by property owners because that, in fact, that such a marriage increased their property value. This law of 1664 represents, if not the first, certainly the precursor to anti-miscegenation law. These are laws that punished or prohibited marriage between, notice that white people didn't exist yet in 1664, at least as referenced in that law. But most generally speaking, anti-miscegenation law prohibited and punished marriages between a white person and a specific non-white person or persons. Let me be really clear. I read all the time in history books, in academic texts, and I read anti-miscegenation law described as prohibiting interracial marriage. That's not correct. For example, a member of a native tribe could marry a person of Chinese descent. Both were understood as racially distinct, but never did anti-miscegenation law prohibit such kinds of marriages. The only marriages that anti-miscegenation law prohibited were those between a white person and always a person of African descent, and sometimes various other groups. Okay, so just so we're really clear about anti-miscegenation law and its link to whiteness. A couple other things to note about anti-miscegenation law. It's not derived from British law. Anytime we look at law and study history and you see a break from British common law, you always want to pay attention because it tells us something about the needs and desires of those who wielded power in the colonial context. So anti-miscegenation law was one of these laws. They were passed colony by colony and then state by state. It's a really important area of law for a number of reasons. But for our purpose this morning is because it's where this human category called white first appears on planet Earth, the first time. In addition, anti-miscegenation law is important because it lasted more than 300 years. These anti-miscegenation laws literally shaped the faces of this group of more than 2,000 X number of people that I'm looking at today. The Maryland legislature sought to correct for the encouragement of marriages that they described in that previous law of 1664 as, quote, a disgrace, unquote, to the British people, as an indication that the, quote, British or freeborn woman must be forgetful of her status as free, end quote. So they passed the law of 1681. And in this law, it made it illegal for British and other white women from marrying a Negro slave. And furthermore, the law punished any landholder who encouraged the marriages and any religious authority who performed it. This law equals the invention of the human category white. Did these group of laborers, some of whom were from Portugal, some from Holland, some from Ireland, Scotland, did they have a little genetic transformation that occurred right after the General Assembly in Maryland met, creating a genetic sludge that we can now call white? Virginia passed its first anti-miscegenation law in 1691. In Virginia, the law prohibited both white men and white women from marrying a person of African descent or a member of a native tribe. But lest I leave you thinking that gender equality was being created in this law, let me quickly dispel that. Studies of antebellum courts reveal that, in fact, anti-miscegenation law was that, at least in the language of the law, prohibited these marriages for white men and white women. But here's what we know from antebellum court cases. We know that plenty of white men married and or engaged in intimate sexual relations with prohibited women. However, very rarely were they brought to court and punished under the anti-miscegenation law. Very rarely. So here, pay attention to this. This law, in its enforcement, is largely focused on controlling the relationality and the sexuality of white women and non-white men. Furthermore, think about the enforcement practices that come out of this particular law. What's the result? Who becomes more available for who? We see a further step in locating patriarchal power squarely among and within white men. We've talked about the law of 1664 and the amendment to that law in 1681. And we've noted that the key difference between those two is the reference to the group who's of concern. The language has shifted from British and other freeborn to British and other white women in that particular law. So the question becomes, well, what the heck happened between 1664 and 1681? And the answer is Bacon's Rebellion. This was a massive revolt in the colony of Virginia that lasted more than a year. Let me give some background of the seeds of this rebellion, what helped give rise to this violent outburst. Those who were enslaved, I don't think it's hard to imagine, were by definition of their status disgruntled laborers. And remember that pool of readily available workers from England who were poor and happily sent off in the guts of ships? Well, they dried up. That population surge ended, and there was no longer a pool of laborers from Britain available to handle the work on the plantations in the colonies. The result is they began to impose harsher punishments on indentured servants who were already here, so that relatively minor infractions would result in significant extensions to their years of service. Those who completed their term of indenture or who were released from their status as enslaved were frustrated. They were frustrated because the King of England gave almost all of the farmable land to his buddies. And even if they could find land to grow tobacco on, prices dropped and taxes went up. So land and other opportunities became much more limited. So this guy, Nathaniel Bacon, the guy pointing his arm, he didn't have to search very far for disgruntled laborers. Both those who were enslaved or indentured faced worse treatment, and those freed faced less ability to make a future for themselves. Persons of European and African descent fought in the first phase of Bacon's rebellion against members of native tribes, and then in the second phase of Bacon's rebellion against the British ruling elite. Nathaniel Bacon ultimately died from wounds that he received in a battle, and England sent troops into the colony, and that eventually quashed the rebellion, but not without having made a significant impression upon those who wielded authority and were threatened by this rebellion. Remember, this rebellion lasted over a year, and records from lawmakers in Virginia to the Legal Oversight Authority in England revealed that over 30% of the population were in support of the rebellion. Here were the lessons from Bacon's rebellion. A united labor force is a threat to the form of capitalism taking hold within the colonies. Virginia lawmakers wrote letters to the Oversight Authority in London explaining that they intended to pursue a divide and conquer strategy in order to prevent future rebellion. It's only after Bacon's rebellion that we see the emergence of white people as a group of humanity. Let's think about this for a minute. 1681, some lawmakers invent a new label for a group of people. Imagine, if you will, just for a second, for fun here, that I'm a lawmaker, and I just pass a law claiming that 3/4 of you in this room are crunchies. Okay? So 3/4 of you are crunchies, and the other quarter of you are not. Who gives a damn? Who would care? Some silly lawmaker came up with a label for you. It's really unlikely that it would mean much. But let's say I follow it with this. Those who are crunchies, you can pay no more than $25 a night for that hotel. No more. Those who are crunchies are the first to come into any room at this conference and the first to leave. The first in line at the bathroom, at lunch, at any other line that forms, and the first to get to leave. And that these privileges and advantages that come by virtue of this label that I asserted upon you as a lawmaker continues when you walk out these doors. That it shapes how you are treated and what you get to do for years and years to come. Imagine you're one of the crunchies. Imagine how you might start to feel. Wow, I must be special. Imagine you're not a crunchy. Wow, what's wrong with me? This is not fair. Let's return to the divide and conquer strategy. Laborers, prior and through Bacon's rebellion, were united. They lived the same darn lives. They faced the same opportunities, rights, and privileges once they were freed from enslavement or free from indenture. That's about to change. A slew of laws were passed in the decades after Bacon's rebellion and continued to get passed into the first quarter of the next century. The first slew of laws included the prohibition of free blacks from holding public office, the prohibition of blacks and native tribal members from marrying whites, the requirement that whites, upon completion of their terms of service, be paid goods including guns and gunpowder, a prohibition of free blacks possessing a weapon. We're going to come back to that. The prohibition of blacks testifying against whites. These laws began to give different meaning to these labels that prior to this moment just referenced where your nation of origin was. Not anymore. I want to return quickly to the law that prohibited free blacks from possessing a weapon. What this law did was essentially strip free black men of their ability to hold patriarchal power. Because look, under the law of coverture, here's how things worked. Men were in control, controlled women, their spouse, controlled their children, and had legal authority to do so, including severe beatings, all financial assets and land. The man had the control, but the exchange was that in exchange for that authority, he protects. That's the trade-off for patriarchal power. Stripped, made impossible by virtue of this law. And then let's look at this law that prohibited blacks from testifying against whites. We will see that throughout US history. Mexicans prohibited from testifying against whites, Chinese prohibited from testifying against whites, and then it just becomes mongrels, the label, to include persons of Japanese descent and the like. So that's a law that we see throughout US history. When you look at these laws, what's the message to white people? Each one of these laws has a message to this new group of people called white folks, on the one hand, and a message to those who it denies or restricts on the other. Each one of them. This package of laws, first passed after Bacon's Rebellion, did something extraordinary. Let's imagine that that light up there represents the landholding elite, the 1%. And this represents the socioeconomic ladder in the colony, okay? And so this hand over here represents this new group of laborers called white ones. And this hand over here represents laborers of African descent and members of native tribes. Before Bacon's Rebellion and through it, these laborers had the same lives, faced the same opportunities, and that changed. But when you look at these laws that passed that created this change, it divided these, created different meaning for this group versus this group, but it didn't do a whole lot to lift the economic status of white people closer to that of the white elites. Very little movement up. What it did do was it plummeted the bottom, created a new bottom to colonial society, and shoved persons of African descent and members of native tribes there. So let's look at this group of humanity called white people. We learn from this history that white people were built upon the idea that British had of themselves as white, as Christian, as freeborn, as deserving of rights and privileges from which others can be denied. To this day, white people have not been defined as a matter of law to this day. This history teaches us that white is the tool by which laborers were divided. Those who shared the same living conditions, the same opportunities, now experience ourselves as more connected with Paris Hilton than with our African American neighbor, even though our economic status is far more similar to that neighbor than to the lives of the 1%. But not only did this new organization of society create a new bottom to it, it created a link that heretofore had not existed, that connected this new group of laborers called white people with the elite. And what was that connection? This shared status called white, embedded with the presumption of its superiority. The other thing to note about the invention of white people and the meaning of white that this history reveals is that white constituted the center of patriarchal power. And we see that most clearly through anti-miscegenation law and specifically through its enforcement. We're going to move from the 17th century into the 18th century. The American Revolution has taken place, and the First Congress of the United States of America will meet for the first time. And when they meet, they will establish laws regarding citizenship in this new country. This is the building actually in New York where the first Congress met. Here are the men who represented the first Congress. These laws regarding citizenship include an area of law called naturalization law. Naturalization law provides the process by which one who is not born in a country can become a citizen. The first Congress of the United States determined 1790 that in order to become a naturalized citizen of this new republic called the United States of America, one had to be white. This was valid law in the United States until 1952. You had to be white to be a US citizen. 1952. Now, as is often the case, laws impact those who are gendered female differently than those who are gendered male. No less true with the naturalization law. For example, white women who were citizens, if they dared to marry a man who was ineligible for citizenship via the naturalization law, in other words, he wasn't white, she loses her citizenship. These laws work to make white women most available to white men, and frankly, all women available to white men. The requirement of whiteness in naturalization law has had a significant impact on various groups of people who've come to the United States of America. In fact, the naturalization law was a significant piece of evidence used in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896 to determine that U.S. citizenship status and therefore the protections of the constitutions were never intended to be applied to persons of African descent. Naturalization law assured that the masses of Chinese laborers and then Japanese laborers and then various other groups of laborers who came to this country would remain cheap, dependent labor. Why? Because even though they were significant in number, especially relative to their employer and landholders and railroad companies, if you're not white, you're not a U.S. citizen. If you're not a U.S. citizen, you don't vote. If you can't vote, you can't voice your political needs and desires, thereby reducing these groups of people to dependent, cheap labor. In addition, naturalization law was used to block persons of Chinese and Japanese and Filipinos, and we could go on, various groups. Not only did it result in them getting paid less for doing the same job, but all kinds of taxes got imposed upon them. So there was a foreign wage tax, various laws were passed that blocked them from being able to work in the public sector, blocked them from being able to hold a managerial position, and then of course alien land laws were passed. These were laws that made it illegal for those ineligible for naturalization, i.e. not white people, made it illegal for them to own property. And so what's the result of these laws for white people, right? Because we're real good about seeing the harm that these laws cause for certain groups. But let's get the flip side of that coin. When I make land, when I make a whole group of people ineligible to purchase land, it makes more land available and cheaper for me, for white people. When you're the lowest paid worker and prohibited from moving up as a matter of law, then those positions that get paid more, that are more desirable, are more available to white people. So we see just from this one law, and I could spend another hour with you at least going through these combinations of law, naturalization law, anti-miscegenation law, and immigration policy, all that combined in these ways to continue to advantage, to give economic value, symbolic value to white people, to give us the unearned advantages that we continue to receive today. I have a favor to ask. Would y'all close your eyes for a moment? Just close your eyes. Imagine a society where white supremacy is not embedded in our institutions. Sit with it. Think of the prison complex. Think of our education system. Think of church on Sunday, synagogue on Saturday, temple, mosque. Think about the organization of neighborhoods. Think about the government of the United States and how assets and resources would be distributed. Looks pretty different, doesn't it? White supremacy, you can open your eyes if you like, is institutionally embedded in the United States of America as a matter of foundational law. So what do? Whatever image you had of an institution, an example, a relationship that was free of institutionalized and personally held onto white supremacy, hold that. Hold on to it. It's a glimpse, it's a tool to tell us where we need to go, where we can go. It offers hope.
I invite everyone to take a big, deep breath. Coming into our bodies. And I'm going to ask Aimide to facilitate us through a conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. So again, I would like to reinforce what Christine said in terms of just taking a moment to embody what was revealed to us in this video. And there's a couple questions I'd like to ask, and then I'd open the floor for commissioners to respond to any of their notes and also to the questions. The first one is, how does this structure reinforce over-policing? Why is this history important to the commission? Who or what are police here to protect? And soon, Christine will put a link in the chat that talks a little bit about who the police are here to protect. Or what the Supreme Courts have said, who the police are here to protect.
Could you repeat those questions, Aimide,
Absolutely.
please?
How does this structure reinforce over-policing of certain communities? I'll just put that as an accent. Why is this history so important to the commission and in your work? And who or what are the police here to protect in terms of where we are today? Please take your time. I know that there was a lot of information presented, but we definitely would like to hear from you. And feel free to also put any questions you may have in the chat. I'll read them out into the record. Lisa.
Sure, I'll go first. Hi, everyone. I'm Lavisa Lloyd. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member of the commission and I'm a co-chair for this phase of work. And I wanted to say thank you first to our facilitators for bringing this discussion to us today. I think it's really important and it's really helpful. And I love history, so I really enjoy this as a history nerd. I also am a mixed race person myself. I'm mixed black and white, and I'm from the state of Virginia, which, you know, the anti-miscegenation laws that were still on the books in Virginia went to the Supreme Court in like the late 60s, I think, like shockingly close in time to the present moment. And so, you know, my parents' union would not have been legal, you know, pretty relatively soon before I was born. So yeah, so I really appreciate sort of kind of walking through some of this history of miscegenation and what it was designed to protect. But I think the most important thing or the most relevant thing in terms of our work as a commission is the memory. Historically, it's very hard. We don't really have much of a cultural memory of a time when we didn't have race relations in this country that look like what we have now, which is a system of white supremacy, and then, you know, everybody else, essentially. And I think the kind of the visual clue that, you know, the presenter gave with like the light bulb is up here, and then, you know, that's the 1%, and then everyone else is down here. And there was this time when the structure was really quite similar in terms of laborers between, you know, white and non-white. And this idea that, you know, there was this time, you know, before, I think she said something like white people were invented in 1681 or white people did not exist before 1681, which is, you know, kind of a hilarious statement, but it's sort of like the concept of like whiteness, like as a legal entity, not really existing, and it being, you know, invented. But before that, there being an equity in terms of like having the ability to vote, even having the ability to own slaves, you know, having the ability to marry like, you know, anybody of any nationality, you know, of the opposite sex, quote unquote. So I think, yeah, and just kind of coming back to the commission, it's like in terms of like framing our work, the history of policing in this country has just such deep roots that are tied to the civil rights movement, and just that was a period of like great strengthening of police unions in this country, and it's interesting because it's sort of it all ties together, it all goes together, and I think it's just like it's so refreshing to have that moment to say like, hey, like there was a time with a different system, people came up with the current system that we have. It's not infinite, it was invented, and so we can imagine different things.
Thank you, Lavisa. Commissioner Catherine.
Yeah, thank you. And good evening, everybody. And yeah, I thought that was a really interesting lecture. It was, well, you know, I certainly encountered many of those concepts, but I thought that the presenter put them together in a compelling and persuasive way. My takeaway from it was really that, you know, the foundation of white supremacy is really to protect property interests and promote a capitalist agenda that protects property owners, and especially property owners who own significant or who hold significant wealth, and wealth transfers into power. So you have then those folks pretty cynically really employing the legal system, passing laws that are designed to ensure that their economic status is not threatened. And then once you have laws, you have to have some entity to enforce those laws. And that's where, you know, our policing system came in. I've certainly read the scholarship about our policing system coming out of the, you know, the attempts by slave owners to ensure the perpetuation of slave-related laws. You know, I know some people contest that, but that there's a fair amount of scholarship on that. So I think that while that wasn't discussed in the lecture, I think that's sort of it logically follows from what we did here. So coming back to, you know, our current situation, you know, we certainly get a lot of, there's always a lot of concern about property, the preservation of property. And it seems like within our community, even the last few years, you've heard a lot of people debating whether, you know, the preservation of property is ultimately a higher interest than, you know, the rights of the folks in this community to access property, to be able to, you know, enjoy our community or express their opinions in our community. If that threatens property interests, it seems like that's when the police get involved. And that's, you know, one way I think of describing the events of the last few years in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Catherine. Any other comments? Commissioner Stevebob?
Yeah, I completely echo, you know, Commissioner McDowell and in understanding why and who they protect. So I come to this commission, you know, and I'll say it, I don't talk about it much, if at all. I think the only time I ever talked about this was in a singular Facebook post. That was not even a public one. But I, 2 generations removed from the Gurmit, which was a Hindustani term for agreement, and we were called facetiously the Gurmit. The agreement was because I'm 2 generations removed from indentured slavery in Fiji Islands through my mom's side. And so that means my mom's father, you know, was Gurmit. And just always remembering the pictures, the very colorful pictures of him in his 80s, in the mid to late 70s. You can see the structure of the veins in his arms and his hands. And an old man, you know, by then, you know, he was 88 in this picture, but his hands were robust and heavy and leathery, and the rest of him kind of weakened, standing, holding himself in composure. My mom's one of 13 children. She's the last 2 remaining of her siblings that's alive right now. knowing how her and her siblings made it through all that, how he earned his freedom and raised a family, and did an amazing job doing that, but then still seeing the very close generational trauma of being one generation removed from him, of children being raised and really making their mark and having the opportunity to do so, because within a 40-year span, the British rulership and their plantation company abandoned ship and just left people there. And that's how indentured servitude kind of ended. So when I had that, and I'm this little kid growing up in LA, I really understood what my community was going through. I went to a specific mosque one day, and I suddenly found myself being able to relate to everything they were talking about. It was African-American community of Muslims, and they were speaking about practicing religion and faith in this country in a way that I hadn't heard from more structured, privileged Arab or South Asian based mosques, and not a lot of Pacific Islander based Muslims to know. So, you know, you're growing up around a very privileged society, knowing your own history, but not being able to connect the dots. And I really connected it that way. And that allowed me to organize at a young age around, you know, gang violence prevention, gun violence prevention and reduction, in a root causal way, you know, manually, feet on the ground, boots on the ground in South Central, and just moving with our community leaders. And from that point on, having a history, a historical view, and understanding that they're not here to prevent anything. They're here to prevent or protect structures of power, whether it be property or corporate ideas and zoning laws, and removing industry and rezoning things to a point where industry was distant and intangible and drove the economy further and further down in neighborhoods, and created hoods in South Central and stuff like that, in Compton and Watts, created, you know, intentional by design, redlining, Wells Fargo, Washington Mutual, all these things. And then, but I was still cloaked with a certain sense of privilege because I didn't walk around with the apparent, I didn't walk around with the with that identity. People didn't see it. People saw South Asian kid, and there was a lot of privilege that went with that look, and I was able to wield it when in our organizing and our youth and whatnot. It was funny, but then 9/11 happened, and suddenly whatever privilege you're able to utilize in advancing causes for communities around you, you're suddenly having to fight and struggle for your own community now. And the largesse of the privilege in Muslim communities was stripped and laid bare for everyone to look around and be like, what just happened to us? And everything that I learned that my elders had taught to me about organizing, just to wrap up real quick, everything that I had learned about organizing taught me about structures that were covert, that actually through the Patriot Act became overt, became systems, became structuralized forms of oppression. And it all fit right in. It all fit right in with policing. Local, you know, police, county, sheriff, state police, FBI, it all fit right in. And so, you know, it is important to understand that in this country, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment was written. And the two of those linked the fate of this country when it structuralized freeing people, but then 2 years later, providing a structure to employ the slave catchers to become policemen and reinforce the rule of slavery into prison and population. That's the unhealed trauma this country is continually fighting and dealing with. That's why we're all here, and that's why we all have our story. But this is what empowers me to kind of be here and share this story with everyone, that we all have very real and impactful reasons to understand, but a lot of us can also get caught up in the mumbo jumbo of middle and imbalance. But the true balance, the true nature of balance lies in truly understanding that this is a system that can't be reformed. But where do we start with accountability, and how hard do we go?
Oh, okay. Woohoo. Thank you.
The names, it's interesting.
Christopher Paye.
Yes,
We would love to hear from you if you are ready for us.
I'm ready to begin. I just wanted to say hi to everyone. I'm going to go off camera as I do the presentation. I'm an administrative support person here in the Bureau. I'm the Police Review Board Coordinator. I received the email from your commission asking for the 3 items and I'm going to cover those. I'm going to begin my presentation now. So the commission's request that I received was to cover these 3 topics here: the Police Review Board's role within the current accountability system, how the PRB works with internal affairs, the Citizen Review Committee, and other parts of the current system, and then speak to barriers to police accountability in the current system, as well as best practices in the current system. The presentation topics that I'm going to cover today, and please forgive me if some of this will be a repeat of what you've received in prior commission meetings, but I'm going to cover the overview of the administrative process, the types of incidents and complaints referred to the Police Review Board, the Police Review Board purpose, its composition and roles, the findings and their definitions, the post-PRB administrative actions, the agenda of the PRB itself and the process, and then public reporting of outcomes. Where does the Police Review Board occur within the overall process of review? This is the same thing, I believe, as your question of how the PRB works with the Internal Affairs Division, the Citizens Review Committee, and other parts of the current system. The Police Review Board occurs at the conclusion of the administrative investigation. And I know that you had I believe in your previous meeting, you heard from Captain Pashley and Commander Bell regarding the administrative investigative process. The Police Review Board occurs prior to the CRC appeal process, and it occurs prior to any final determination that's made by the Chief of Police and the Commissioner in charge. This diagram will likely look familiar to you. I believe that it's been provided in the past. This is a graphic that shows where the Police Review Board, I've circled where the Police Review Board occurs within the process of review. And you'll see that there are all of these steps that have taken place prior to the Police Review Board, including the intake by Internal Affairs and IPR, the Internal Affairs investigation, the RU manager's review of that investigation with their recommended findings, the branch assistant chief's review of the recommended findings in the investigation, as well as the Internal Affairs captain's review of the investigation and recommended findings, and the Office of the Independent Police Review's review of the investigation and the recommended findings. This graphic illustrates where the Police Review Board occurs within the process of a deadly force and in custody death review. And you'll see that there is an event and a response to that event. IPR and IA conduct their intake, and then detectives is assigned the investigation, as well as Internal Affairs, who conducts an investigation as well. A grand jury is convened in certain cases. The training division conducts their analysis of members' actions during the event. And all of that information, the intake information, the detectives investigation, the grand jury information, and the internal affairs or IPR investigation is then, and the training division analysis is then forwarded to the RU manager, who reviews that information and then makes recommendations with regards to findings. That information is then again forwarded to the branch assistant chief, IPR, and internal affairs, who reviews all of that investigation and the recommended findings. And then those cases are sent to the police review board. This is a graphic that I found very informative that was included in the recent 2020 annual report by IPR. I've circled here the police review board's responsibilities in comparison to the other various parties who take place in this process. And you will see that the police review board is responsible for recommending whether violations occurred and then making recommended discipline when appropriate. I also found this graphic from the IPR annual report helpful as well. It illustrates where the police review board occurs within the overall administrative process. At the conclusion of this presentation, I have the ability to return to any one of these slides if you have any questions. This is a list of various city code and policy bureau directives that govern the various steps within the process of an administrative review, to include the city code, the internal affairs division complaint intake and processing directive, the directive relevant to supervisory investigations, the directive relevant to administrative investigations, the directive relevant to criminal investigations of police bureau employees and other law enforcement agency sworn employees, performance deficiencies, the discipline process, and the police review board. This graphic illustrates where all of those various policies and procedures come into play within the administrative review process. And again, this graphic of the process of review for deadly force and in custody death notes the same. So I was asked to speak to where the police review board's role within the current accountability system. The purpose and the role of the police review board is the police review board serves as an advisory body to the chief of police and makes recommendations as to findings and proposed officer discipline. This is per city code 3.20.140. The board also may make recommendations regarding the adequacy and completeness of an investigation, and may make policy and training recommendations to the chief as well. The board reviews certain incidents and investigated complaints of alleged misconduct, reviews certain use of force incidents, and makes recommendations to the chief regarding findings, action items, and proposed discipline. The police review board role is also covered under Bureau Directive 336. The type of incidents and complaints referred to the police review board include complaints of alleged misconduct, investigations where there is a controverted finding, and investigations where the recommended discipline is a suspension without pay or greater. A controverted finding is when the responsibility unit manager, the employee supervisor, has recommended a finding of proposed discipline that is challenged by the captain of professional standards, the branch assistant chief, or the independent police review division director, or their designee during the process of the investigative review. Other types of incidents and investigated complaints reviewed by the police review board include all officer-involved shootings, physical injury that's caused by an officer that requires hospitalization, all in-custody deaths, and any use of force where the recommended finding is out of policy. It also includes any other use of force case with a controverted finding or at the discretion of the chief, the branch chief, or the IPR director. Additional incidents and investigative complaints reviewed by the Police Review Board include all investigations regarding alleged violations of human resources administrative rules regarding complaints of discrimination resulting in a sustained finding. And the others are discretionary cases, again, referred by the chief, the branch chief, and the IPR director. The Police Review Board, it is composed of 5 voting members and 8 or so advisory members. The quorum of 4 voting members is required to convene a Police Review Board, and that quorum must include a community member and the RU manager or the supervisor of the designee, and 4 advisory members, and that is per City Code 3.20.140. When cases involve a use of deadly force, or an in-custody death, 1 additional community member is drawn on a rotating basis from the pool of current Citizen Review Committee members, and 1 additional peer member serves as well, for a total of 7 voting members. A quorum of 6 voting members, including 2 community members and the RU manager or designee, and 4 advisory members is required to be present to make recommendations to the chief. And these are all covered and required under City Code 3.20.140. The voting members of the Police Review Board include a community member or members, a peer member at the same rank of the or comparable rank of the classification of the Bureau member under review, the assistant chief or their designee, the IPR director or their designee, and the RU manager or their designee. The voting member role and responsibilities include reviewing the allegations and areas of review and cited Bureau directives in the investigative case file, reviewing that investigative case file and all related materials, determining whether the actions of the involved members meet the requirements outlined in the cited Bureau directives, recommending a finding, and articulating how they apply the preponderance of evidence standard to include listing the facts and circumstances to which they give more weight in determining their finding. A finding is a conclusion as to whether or not the member's conduct violated Bureau directives. This is covered under Directive 332.00 Administrative Investigations. Finding is determined by conducting a comprehensive review of all the investigative records and facts and circumstances around the alleged conduct or area of review. The standard of review for determining a finding is the preponderance of evidence standard. The preponderance of evidence the preponderance of evidence standard is defined under Directive 335.00, the discipline process, and it is the facts and circumstances indicated as more likely than not that a violation of policy or procedure either occurred or did not occur. For conduct and performance review cases, the findings are sustained, not sustained, exonerated, and unfounded. And these definitions are found under Directive 335.00 discipline process. In use of deadly force cases, in custody death reviews, the findings are in policy and out of policy. And this is also covered under Directive 332.00 administrative investigations. I see that there's some messages in chat that I'm not checking. Is there anything that I need to be aware of before I continue?
It's mostly just re-referencing your codes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Yes. Other parties who serve on the Police Review Board are the advisory members, and they are listed here. They include the Office of Accountability and Professional Standards Division Manager, a representative from the Bureau of Human Resources, a representative from the City Attorney's Office, the Internal Affairs Division Manager, the Police Review Board Coordinator, a representative of the Commissioner in charge of the Bureau, a representative of the Training Division, and the Assistant Chiefs that are not the supervisors of the involved member. The advisory member's role is to provide clarifying information within their area of expertise. Advisory members do not recommend findings or offer opinions or information outside of their area of expertise. Others who might attend the PRB include the involved members, who are subject to review, members of bargaining units, and representatives from the investigative divisions, such as internal affairs or the detectives division or the training division in use of deadly force cases where they provide presentations to the board. Any other individuals are invited at the discretion of the professional standards division captain. The board is facilitated by a person who's not employed by the police bureau and who is not a member of the board. Their responsibilities include balancing participation amongst board participants, remaining neutral. They have a duty to recuse themselves if there's a strong bias with regard to a particular case, or they have a potential conflict of interest. They're required to maintain strict confidentiality of all case file information, PRB discussions and deliberations, and they're required to prepare a written statement of recommended findings and recommendations, along with any proposed discipline, any policy, training, or investigative issues or concerns that are raised by the Police Review Board. The facilitator's summary statement includes and is addressed to the Chief of Police. It includes the Police Review Board's recommended findings, a brief explanation of the board's rationale and its recommendations, including a description of the recommendations proposed, the range of recommended corrective action or discipline, if any, is made, and any policy, training, or supervisory issues raised by the Police Review Board. In that memo, board members are not identified by name. The board member will also include any recommended action items that are put forward by the Police Review Board. The administrative actions that take place after the Police Review Board include the community members' opportunity for an appeal of the findings. And in cases not referred to the Police Review Board, that appeal process occurs after an RU manager has recommended their findings and IPR, IA, and the branch assistant chief agree with the finding. You're probably asking what cases are not referred to the Police Review Board, and those are the cases that don't meet the qualifying requirements outlined in city code that I covered previously. In cases referred to the Police Review Board, the appeal process occurs after the Police Review Board has recommended their findings and prior to the Chief of Police making a preliminary or final decision. Ultimately, it is the Chief of Police in consultation with the Commissioner in charge who reaches a final decision in the case. The Commissioner is the final decision maker in all officer-involved shootings. Cases where physical injury caused by an officer requires hospitalization, all in custody deaths, any use of force for the recommended finding is out of policy. In all other cases, unless the Commissioner in charge exercises authority over the case, the chief shall make the final decision. After the Chief of Police and the Commissioner make a determination with regards to findings and other recommendations, if there are not sustained or in policy findings, the case is administratively closed. And if there are sustained or out of policy findings, certain administrative actions occur to include corrective action or disciplinary action. Approved action items are assigned for implementation as well. If the chief determines there are sustained or out of policy findings, administrative actions occur, including corrective or disciplinary actions. These will include command counseling or a letter of reprimand, suspension without pay, or demotion or termination. And here's where those administrative actions take place that I was just referring to within the process overall. Here's a brief description and diagram of the discipline process. The employee is notified of the proposed discipline. They are provided with the opportunity to meet with the chief to provide any information they want the chief to consider before a final decision is made. That meeting, of course, takes place. The chief makes their final decision, and if there is imposed discipline, the imposed discipline letter is prepared. The letter is reviewed and approved by the Chief of Police, reviewed and approved by the mayor, and the letter of imposed discipline is then delivered to the employee. And then there are certain administrative clerical actions that take place after that prior to closure. There are two distinct sessions to the agenda format of the Police Review Board. The first part of the session is referred to as the presentation of facts, where there is an overview of the facts presented and presentations in deadly force and custody death cases are given. And a question and answer session occurs related to the facts. That is only to the facts of the case. There is no discussion around findings. Any discussions that are around findings take place during what is referred to as executive session, which is the latter half of the proceeding. And in executive session, the voting members of the board participate in a group discussion and around individual findings for each area of review or allegation, and then provide their rationale and support of their finding. After that discussion occurs, then everyone is again asked to provide their official recommendation for a finding and their supporting rationale. There's also the discussion that will take place around corrective action or disciplinary actions if there is a sustained finding or an out of policy finding. And of course, during executive session at the conclusion of the process is when board members have the opportunity to put forward any other recommendations relevant to the case under review. This is a graphic description of that process itself. So you can see that it is broken into the presentation of case stage and then the executive session stage of the proceeding. It is during the presentation of the case where there's a roll call, the handouts are reviewed, the board purpose and rules are read, and then the RU manager is invited by the facilitator to present their summary of the facts of the case. Voting board members are provided with the opportunity to ask any questions around those facts. If the involved member is present, they have the opportunity to make a statement to the board. They're not required to attend. If they do attend and they make a statement, voting board members are invited to ask them questions clarifying anything in the statement that they've made. The board then moves into executive session, where there is a presentation around each allegation or area of review, and the RU manager will lay out their finding and the rationale in support of their finding. There will then be a group discussion amongst the voting members of the board around that recommended finding, and each voting member of the board has the opportunity to provide their recommended finding and the rationale in support of their recommended finding. After that discussion occurs, they are asked to provide their official recommended finding and rationale in support of their finding. And if there are any sustained findings or out of policy findings, the review board coordinator is asked to provide the employee's corrective action or discipline history so that can be taken into consideration in application with the Bureau's discipline guide and making that corrective action or disciplinary recommendation. Conclusion of that process is when the discussion is open amongst all members of the board for any recommendations to be put forward at that time. And the board concludes with a summary of the outcomes by the facilitator. This is the same graphic representation of that process. However, in the presentation of case stage, you will see that presentations are made by the detective division, the internal affairs division, the training division. So there's additional presentations are provided and use of deadly force and in custody death reviews. Otherwise, that follows the same format as the previous slide. Police Review Board outcomes are publicly reported. These reports are published to the Police Bureau website. These include copies of the Police Review Board memos prepared by the facilitator. And unless there's public interest requiring disclosure, or if non-disclosure would undermine the public's confidence, the reports keep confidential information confidential and do not include complainant, employee, or witness names. The reports are not released prior to any final decision that's been made, including the disciplinary action by either the chief or the commissioner in charge. Guidance given for board members for recommendations for action items include asking themselves if there are opportunities to develop and refine tactics that will further the Police Bureau's mission, value, and goals, whether improvements can be made regarding the Bureau's organizational structure or internal processes, asking themselves if there are any needs for clarification within existing policies, and asking themselves how we can improve training. The recommendations that are put forward must be relevant to the case at hand. Nearing conclusion here, I was asked to provide some obstacles to police accountability. I believe that the complexity of the system is an obstacle to police accountability in that it's complex and there are a lot of parts, and I don't know that everybody understands all the complexity within the system. It also seems to grind along because it is so complex and so another issue are unforeseen obstacles and requirements that delay timelines, i.e., a national, state, or local emergency such as the COVID disaster. We've had the experience during the past 2 years of running into roadblocks for being able to move things forward from time to time. Of course, we've worked through solutions to some of the problems that we've had. Another obstacle that I see to police accountability is a lack of training resources and a lack of training. I know that our community members have asked for training opportunities that it's often difficult to fulfill, either due to a lack of staffing or a lack of time or resources or et cetera. The obstacles that I identified were obstacles that I believe fall within, the role of the Police Review Board and the administration of the Police Review Board. I didn't speak to any other obstacles outside of that area. And I thought I had another slide here. That spoke to best practices. It's not present, but I would say that one of the best practices is, it's kind of ironic because one of the best practices is the complexity of the system that we have in place. Currently, it was developed over many, many years with community member involvement. And so, I think that system provides some uniformity within the process itself. It standardizes a lot of our processes as well. Yeah, and I don't have anything else. That's the conclusion of my presentation. I'm available to take any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner, or excuse me, Christopher Paye. We appreciate you spending your time here with us. We'll now take questions from Mr. Paye. Respond to them. Please keep your questions brief. Please allow me to facilitate the questions, and please ask your questions that help the commission move forward towards identifying barriers to police accountability and best practices, which is the proposal of this phase of work. Excuse me. Connie, Commissioner Connie.
Yes, I'm Connie Wan. I use she, her pronouns. Thanks, Christopher, for being here this evening. Is there a regular check-in or way that these best practices are amended, or the process is even ever evaluated or revisited?
Are you talking about the administrative process overall?
Yeah, and just like, are there cases that ever come up that create review, or, like, is there policy in place for that evolution of terms and policy?
So is there a policy in place for a required technical review of the administrative process? Is that your question?
Yes, or, have there been cases that create the need, or, I'm just curious about how the process, like how does it continue to evolve as like things evolve, like the world evolves?
Yeah, so I know that there are routine reviews of our bureau directives, and those bureau directives are posted to the Police Bureau website for public input. And so I think that that's one opportunity to revisit those policies and make suggested changes and make changes to those policies. I can't think of any one particular case that's been through the police review board that had an impact in that regard. But of course, you know, we're always, and I know that members of our staff are always looking at ways to improve the process. So for example, I would suggest improving the process by having, you know, having a change made to our advisory member staff to include a racial equity manager participate in those reviews. And so I've made that recent suggestion, but you know, there are the opportunities to make those suggestions. Every board member is, you know, they do receive instruction and do understand, I believe that they understand that they can make recommendations relevant to how we administer a case. So if those questions were to come up in any one particular case or concerns, then we would likely see perhaps a recommendation come from a board member in that regard. But that hasn't been my general experience.
Thank you.
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand if there was, you know, a process is in place, as you know, our equity training before, and what we're, you know, just seeing in current sort of world events. It's like there is no updating or evolution of, you know, certain processes and documentation. So just a question on my mind. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Christopher. Commissioner Jason?
Thank you. Thanks, Christopher, for coming to speak to us.
You're welcome.
Could you, I asked this question of Jeff Bell last week. Do you see, is there anything that PRB does which the future oversight board could not do?
Could you elaborate on your question?
Sure. Is there any legal thing that you can do, that the PRB can do, that the oversight board can't do? Any administrative action?
Yeah, I would
what
ask.
Cannot be done?
You know, if it's a legal consideration or question, I would ask that you reserve that question for the city attorney. And it's my understanding that they're giving a presentation to you in the near future.
Let me ask you and see if you know of anything that the PRB can do that this oversight board cannot do.
Given that I don't know how the board will operate and it's in development, I can't answer that question.
So let me ask a follow-up then. What do you see the future role of the PRB being?
The future role of the police review board is whatever the citizens of Portland decide that the future role of the police review board is.
So you don't have an opinion about it, or any thought about that?
No.
Thank you.
Commissioner Handelman.
Good evening, Specialist PAC. This is Dan Handelman with Portland Cop Watch usually, but tonight with the commission. I use he, him pronouns. You're familiar with our comments often on those reports that come out that you mentioned. I only get 2 minutes to talk, so I'm going to list a barrage of things, but I'm going to end with the question I want you to answer. If you want to answer any of the other ones, that's fine. But I just want to point out that the RU manager who gives the presentation also votes and also makes the original decision, so they're voting on their own presentation, which is kind of unusual. That the code allows for names to be presented if they've already appeared in the media, but I've never seen that happen. I'm not sure why that is. That basically the executive session is a double closed door meeting because nobody's allowed in to the original PRB meeting except for the number of people that you talked about in the first place, and then a further closed door meeting happens inside of that. And I have an ongoing question is why, this is my big question, is why officer-involved shootings are treated as reviews instead of misconduct investigations. They have a separate set of findings, and if somebody files a complaint about a shooting, they're not handled in the same way because there's already a review that's going on. Okay, but my question is, why is the civilian who is harmed or their survivors, if they've been killed, not allowed in to the police review board hearing? Thank you.
Yeah, the PRB process was developed several years ago and bargained with the police union and does not include the complainant beyond the notifications provided about whether the allegation was sustained or not. It's my understanding, again, that your future meeting will include a session with the city attorney's office. And I believe this question is better asked of them as it involves the bargaining and discipline.
Thank you, Commissioner Handelman. And also thank you to Commissioner Jason. I forgot to mention that before. Commissioner Seamon.
Greetings, Specialist Paya. My name is Seema Husseini, co-chair for the fact-finding phase with our Police Accountability Commission here. My question is just based on your feedback on, barriers to our accountability. And you mentioned that, how, I apologize, I'll paraphrase, but you had mentioned how confusing the system could be. And I would wonder and ask, based on your experience in your role, what elements do you see that can be edited out of the process? Or what is your experience even with redundancies within your bureaucratic process?
Well, I wish I was prepared to answer your question with regards to redundancies within the process. It's been my experience in this process as it has developed over time that the process hasn't necessarily shrunk, it has grown. And that may be because, over time, any number of considerations or things that haven't happened in the past happen. And then, there's an adjustment made to the policy or procedure, additional language is clarifying information is provided, et cetera. So I don't know the answer to your question. I think that that's going to be the challenge for this body as you review all of these policies and procedures. There is no doubt there probably are some redundancies that from directed to directive. And so within the Police Bureau, there may be redundant language or duplicative language included in one directive that's also included in another. So it's that, that may be a redundancy that exists, but I don't have an answer to your question. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Commissioner Seamon. Commissioner Lavisa.
Thank you, Mr. Paye, for being with us. I wanted to go back to the proceedings. Could you maybe just tell us again quickly, maybe for example, just sort of roughly how long does a proceeding take with PRB, and then in terms of voting, who is voting, and what are the numbers in terms of representatives?
Okay. Could you repeat your first question? Your first question again?
Oh, my first question was about how long does a proceeding take?
Proceedings, depending upon how many allegations there are to review and how many areas of review there are, it could take anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours or more. Generally, the use of deadly force reviews take at least 3 hours of time. And then if you're looking at a performance issue with a single allegation, the board may last an hour and a half or so.
Okay, thank you. And my second question was, is answered, by, these slides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the voting members of the board are a community member or two community members in use of deadly force and in custody death reviews and in certain force cases. A peer member or two peer members, depending on the case type, the branch assistant chief, the IPR director or their designee, and the RU manager or supervisor of the involved member under review.
Sorry, and RU stands for?
Responsibility unit manager.
Okay. When you say the assistant chief or designee, when you say or designee for these?
Yeah, it may be that an assistant chief that participated in the initial investigative review is on vacation, mm-hmm. or out of the office for an extended period of time, and so it would be that acting assistant chief that may fill in that role.
So is this like their boss, the assistant chief,
It can be, yes.
their superior officer?
hmm
Okay. Okay, I think those are my questions. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Commissioner Luisa. Commissioner Debbie?
Hey, Debbie Iona, she, her, I'm a commission member.
Hello.
Hi, I'm curious if, setting the union contract issues aside, can you think of changes that could be made in the way the process happens that would make it more open to the public? Because I always wondered, like labor law, HR rules, those kinds of things, do they have any effect on the fact that, for example, the complainant can't be there or members of the public can't observe?
Currently they do. And so again, I would, I'm not an attorney.
Okay.
I'm not qualified to answer those legal questions or speak to them. So I would, suggest that you refer those to the city attorney in their presentation.
Thank you. We'll save them. Thanks.
I wish I could say I was an attorney. I wish I had the education of an attorney.
Commissioner Handelman?
Thank you. I want to make it clear that if anything I said is inaccurate, I want you to try to correct me while you're here so that people don't think I'm making this stuff up. But one of the things that occurs to me, if that this commission's might be interested in, is that the board, when there's 7 people, could be a split vote, like 3 to 2 to 2 with no majority, or when it's 5 people, it could be 2 to 2 to 1 vote, so that there's no real majority opinion going forward. Can you kind of explain what that looks like when the chief receives something like that?
Yeah, so when there are, in cases where there are differing findings and differing opinions in support of those findings, again, the facilitator prepares the memo that's given to the chief. The chief reviews the investigative case file and reviews any exhibits with the case file. He takes into consideration the board's rationale as well. But ultimately, it's the chief of police that will reach a conclusion as to the findings for many of the allegations in the case, and just like where there are those varying recommended findings.
Thank you.
And the chief is required to operate under the same standard of review that the voting board members are required to operate as well.
Commissioner Handelman? Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Commissioner Charlie?
Hi, Mr. Pai.
Hello.
Michelle Wesley, she, her pronouns. On the slide of the part where the facts are being presented, could you pull that up?
I believe you might be referring to the agenda process slides.
I believe so. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so where it says involved member statement, is that like the officer involved, and that is where possibly where the person affected is not invited to ask questions at this juncture?
There is not, the complainant is not involved in the police review board proceeding itself.
At all?
Correct. And that's a part of that reason. I mean, one of the reasons is that it's a part of the discipline process and a disciplinary proceeding. So again, the city attorney will be able to better answer that question for you. So there is, the complainant doesn't have involvement in this part of the process. The complainant has involvement after the police review board. And that would occur here.
In the appeal?
In the appeal.
Okay. Second question, if I may. you said there was a lack of training and training resources. And what kind of training is that? What does that involve?
That may be any type of training that's determined by the chief or members of the board to be necessary and needed. It's my understanding that the training division has a limited number of resources and a limited number of slots to fill for community member participation in training and all of the various training programs that they offer. Because those, with the limited number of slots, and we're looking at members of the CRC who need training, or members of the PRB who need training, and then members of the training division, training advisory council as well, and any other of those other community groups where there's that request for training. So it may be, I can't speak to the type of training that they provide. I know that they provide a variety of training, whether it's related to force, or courtesy or what have you.
How about like anti-racism types of training?
The Police Review Board and the CRC members receive that, a training session when they are onboarded into the process, but we currently don't have any ongoing continuing education in that regard.
Okay. How about the counseling part? What does that look like?
The council, I'm not sure what you're referring
You
to.
mentioned they could be, the recommendation could be counseling.
Oh, a command counseling is the lowest level of corrective action, which is non-disciplinary in nature. It's a conversation that occurs between the involved employee and their supervisor regarding the violation. And in those discussions, the supervisor communicates their expectations moving forward and then documents that in a memo that's then placed in the file.
So it's just that one meeting.
It's the meeting that occurs after the police review board, correct?
And they call that counseling.
Command counseling.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And that's all defined. If you have more questions about those definitions and what those mean, they're covered in the Bureau's Discipline Directive number 335.00.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. I'd like to ask May to read your question out loud if you can. I know that you were having some technical difficulties, but I want to see if that's possible. Commissioner May.
I'm saying that the question is, are there any plans to make continual training a requirement?
Yes.
Yeah. I do not know the answer to that question. Not to my knowledge. Well, we do have a continual training requirement in Bureau Directive. It does require that our Police Review Board members go on ride-alongs at least once a year, and then participate in whatever training is developed. I would just say that at this time, we're looking at what we can do post-COVID. We've been in a period of 2 years where we can't really do a whole lot of anything. We're looking at plans now on what training we can develop moving forward, as well as those ride-alongs that can now take place.
Thank you. Commissioner Catherine.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Catherine McDowell. I use she, her pronouns. When we had previous briefings from the folks at IPR, they mentioned just how extraordinary the last couple of years have been for them with all of the protests, the uprising, Black Lives Matter issues, and concerns about how the police handled crowd control in those situations and the number of complaints that came in. So I just had a couple of questions. I wanted you to address whether those complaints went through the use of force process, whether, what your observation was about how the PRB was able to manage that volume of complaints, and then what happens in a situation where an individual feels mistreated by the police is in a crowd control situation where they can't identify the police officer because of either the chaos or there's not a clear identification. And the police officer is not clearly identified, which was a problem during times in the protests, and just how that kind of complaint. I mean, does the PRB look at complaints generally about how, would that go to like how the supervisor was, would that end up being a complaint against the supervisor at that time because there's not a particular officer named in the complaint? So I know there's a series of questions there, but it's really just, could you give us your observations about how the PRB worked over the last few years in light of the volume of the complaints that came out of crowd control practices? Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I can't speak to how the administrative investigative process occurs. I'm not an expert in that area. Those questions related to the number of complaints and those that were forwarded to the Police Review Board and the reasons why or why not would be better answered by IPR and the Internal Affairs Division. There have been some cases that have been referred to the Police Review Board related to force and protest events. I know that they were very thoughtful discussions and they were lengthy discussions, but not all complaints regarding force are referred to the Police Review Board. So again, I would defer to the IPR director and our Internal Affairs Division captain to enumerate why that's the case. But one of the things that would be instructive is visiting the directives that speak to their role and how they administratively process those cases. So again, the cases that would have been referred to, the cases that were involving force that would have been referred to the Police Review Board would have been referred because there was a sustained finding for the use of force, or it would have been referred at the discretion of the reviewing parties, even if there were not a sustained finding. And when there is a sustained finding for a use of force, it's required to be heard by the Police Review Board.
Thank you. Due to
You're
time, I'm going to have to ask other members to put their questions in the chat. I'll end with Commissioner Lavisa, and we'll move to public comment.
Thanks. I wanted to ask really quickly, the community members who serve as voting members, how many of them are there, and are they volunteers? Are they compensated in any ways, or a stipend?
They are not compensated. I believe that we currently have 9 Police Review Board members, volunteers, and 9, I'm not sure of the number, but around 9 CRC members. Did I answer your questions?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we are now going to take public comment on the issues discussed in the briefing. We ask members of the public to keep their comments on the briefing or questions to the briefing to 2 minutes in length at most, and raise their hand in Zoom if they like to speak. I see that there are some Q&A questions. Christine, would you like to, well, first I'd like to check in with Jasmine and Philip, if you would want to read your questions out. Starting with Jasmine, I suppose.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I have my question in the chat, but I'm happy to voice it as well. I know that you said that, sometimes there are 1 or 2 community members and sometimes there are 1 or 2 peer members. I was wondering, is the balance of Bureau members to non-Bureau members on the vote who are voting always majority Bureau members, or are there times when it's not?
You've got the RU manager, who's a Bureau member, the IPR director, who's not a Bureau member, the branch assistant chief, who is a Bureau member, the community member volunteer, who's not a Bureau member, and then the peer member. So the ratio is 4 to 3.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Philip?
And my name's Philip Tochka. I use he, him pronouns. My question is, since the PRB is an advisory board, how often, and is it rare or is it often that the chief decides a different outcome than the PRB decides?
I wouldn't say that it occurs often. It does occur from time to time.
Thanks.
Thank you, Philip, for your question. If there are any other questions from the public, this would be the time to have them answered. Okay, thank you to the public who asked their questions of sorry, I got caught up. Thank you for the comments that you tongue-tied for your questions. And I would like to thank you, Christopher Paye, right? I want to make sure I'm saying it right. Paye.
Paye.
Yeah, thank you for your time with
You're
us
welcome.
here at the commission.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. Have a great evening. And I also want to go to just general public comment because we are at 8:40. Oh, I just lost my time. 8:47. So we've had a very long meeting. So I want to check in and see if there is any other public comments. Christine, would you mind doing the general public comment portion of our things? I'm like, my mouth is broken.
I'll be glad to. I will be glad to. Not a problem.
Getting late.
Right, exactly. We will now take open public comment on the issues the PAC is discussing, or community members can tell their story about policing and police accountability. We ask members of the public to keep their comments or questions to 2 minutes in length and raise their hand in Zoom if you would like to speak. So I will stop sharing and see if there are any people who would like to speak during public comment. I do not see any raised hands for public comment, Ayomide.
Thank you, Christine. Well, we did, unfortunately, I know that we were supposed to be talking about best practices and barriers. We have 10 minutes left of this meeting. So I guess it would be,
Would you like to
I was going to say, would you like to briefly go into that conversation? It's up to the commission. I was going to give that to y'all. Commissioner Seymour.
Yeah, I would vote yes. Go into it. And I do have a question.
I agree. As another co-chair, I also would vote yes. Let's have a brief discussion.
Wonderful. And your question, you had a question, Commissioner Seymour?
Well, more of a thought. It seemed like a few questions that I had after hearing the initial answers from him to within our commission community, was going to be one that would be deferred to either the voters in Portland or to legal. So I found that fairly interesting. And then other questions he just simply, like for mine, he didn't have an answer for. I mean, it is the position that he is in. And to me, the idea is clear that he works and lives within a very bureaucratic process. It's very rigid and also sheltered, which is a barrier in itself.
Thank you, Commissioner Seemob. Commissioner Connie, and then Commissioner Sophia.
One of the things I think that would be important to acknowledge in best practices is that the idea that these processes don't happen at the first pass completely complete or correct. One thing I heard through almost everyone's questions to this gentleman were like, you know, why don't these people have representatives? You know, when is the review? Like it needs, I think there's a best practice that should be put in place, that it's like this evolution, this like evolving document, the opportunity to revisit processes and update them. And as we come across, or, you know, different circumstances or cases or things that might help shape or mold the process itself.
Thank you, Commissioner Connie. Commissioner Sophia, and then Commissioner Dan Handelman.
My first comment was I was a little disappointed with the presentation, in the sense that it was providing information, but it was providing, I guess I'm trying to find the words. Yes, the process was presented, but I don't feel like we got a lot of information out of that. I don't know if that makes sense. The other thing is, it was a question that I think may be a best practice in the future, and I didn't get to ask, is, you know, it was regarding training, and it was also regarding cases that did not meet that standard of violating the disciplinary code. And how often does that happen? And do they acknowledge that there's issues with that code, that I would say, use the term, things slip through because they don't quite fit that that code or standard for disciplinary violations? Is there any training that goes back? Do they revisit those things that says, you know, this didn't meet our disciplinary code, but it's a problem? And do they ever go back to that and say, how do we fix that? Or do we do training? That was something that I think we should look into, and I think should have been a best practice for them. Doesn't seem that it even came up. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Dan Handelman, and then Commissioner Lavisa.
Thank you. So one of the things that's a misnomer about this police review board, those civilian members, if you, I know it's so confusing, but if you look at how the process works, there's a pool of 15 or so members. Only one of them ever sits on the board at a time. So there's no time when two of those civilians talk to each other or can defer or agree with each other during one of these hearings. So I don't think there's gonna be a problem if we design a body that is all civilians and takes this process over and stops having a majority police at them. But it's a very disturbing thing that the community members representing the community right now never talk to each other. I also just want to clarify, and I think I said this when the CRC was here, that because of the way they handle deadly force cases, the people who are unhappy with the findings in those cases can't appeal those to the Citizen Review Committee, because they're considered, this is something I brought up, they're considered reviews and not investigations. So right now, you can't appeal it if you disagree with a finding about deadly force case. I think that's a huge barrier right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Handelman. Commissioner Lavisa, and then Commissioner Christian.
Thanks. Commissioner Handelman, did you just say you cannot request or like an appeal of these?
A civilian cannot appeal the police review board review of a deadly force case.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask, follow up quickly? Is that if there's not a complaint about it? Is that right, Dan? So if somebody complains about it, can you?
Unfortunately, this is what I was trying to. I slipped that in, but I should have made it my question. But he's probably going to say somebody else designed the system. No, the way they handle them is that even if a complaint is filed, and I know this because there's somebody who survived being shot and tried to file a complaint, they can't do that because there's an automatic review. So therefore, they can't appeal it either. So this is a huge barrier and very confusing and upsetting. So it doesn't matter if you were involved in a deadly force incident as a civilian or your loved one was, you cannot file a complaint about it in the same way as anybody else can.
Thank you for the clarifying question, Commissioner Catherine. I'm going to go to Commissioner Christian since they haven't spoke. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sweet. Awesome. Yeah, I just wanted to voice my support of what Commissioner Connie said and also what Commissioner Sophia said about the evolving document. I think that is a good idea that I hadn't considered before. And I think that is kind of a barrier that we've seen repeated a couple times from different people who have come from different parts of the review process. So trying to figure out a way where we can kind of revisit practices as time goes on. And then Sophia's point as well of kind of along the same lines of like wondering if there's a way for, again, we don't know if this question wasn't answered, so we're not, they may do this already, but trying to figure out if there's a way that they go back through old files and see if there are discrepancies that they're missing or things that are slipping through the cracks. Because I think that can happen in any system. So those might be things to consider for the future. I just wanted to voice my support of those two things. And thank you to Dan for bringing up that other point. I did not know that. That's shocking and good to know. Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners. I think I'm going to end our discussion at this moment just because we are at 8:57 and we want to make sure that we recap some of what you guys put in the garden plot and go over next steps.
So I have captured in the garden plot inquiry about transparency would go to the city attorney, and then why the claimant is not involved. Christopher said we should go to the city attorney about that also. I think there's some data that you want in terms of when things become public, what does and doesn't go through the process. I think there was a question about that too. And I want to open the garden plot up to staff to see if there's anything that I missed.
There are two questions from Commissioner Dan in the chat that I think also fit here. Can you confirm there's a case where two police cars went through a barricade at the 2020 protest? One officer was disciplined, but the other was not because they were not identified. And then separately, is there an effort underway to address what the compliance officer found where sometimes board members use mitigating factors to decide whether a policy was violated or not, rather than applying those factors only at the time, I believe it's supposed to say, of recommending discipline? Yeah. And then there was another question that was said verbally. I lost it. I think you may have covered it, Dr. Moses.
Okay, thank you. And then Debbie asked, where can we find a copy of the garden plot? It's a list that we keep, that facilitators and staff keep each meeting. So just letting you know that.
So we can't see it then.
Well, excuse me, I'm reading it out at each meeting, but
but isn't there a long list now? Yeah, okay. Well, it'd be nice if someday you could send it to us. Just because I'd be curious to see what's on it. We've probably forgotten 90% of it by now.
We are in the process of creating that list. So yes.
Oh, great. Thanks, Ayumide.
Can we go to next steps as well? We kind of went a little bit out of order. Sorry about that, folks.
Hi, so first thing that's worth mentioning is that for members of the public as well as for members of the commission, the PAC is still, the city is still soliciting applications for a position joining the staff of the PAC. It's an engagement and communications coordinator position. And you can find more information at the website of the PAC has a link to it, and the link is also going to get dropped into the chat. So that's the first thing to mention. Second thing is the PAC is taking a meetings break from, well, as soon as this one wraps up, through July 10th, and we'll resume meeting on July 11th. And this is the upcoming slide. You saw this earlier in the meeting of upcoming meetings beyond that, but there's no meetings July 1st through 10th. And then following that, the next slide, please. Although it is a meetings break, there are some things that members of the commission will be continue to be asked to do. One of them, for every member, there'll be emails going out asking for input on draft documents over time to give input. Members who give input, their comments are shown in track changes at the beginning of the discussion when we actually look at the draft. So it's not editing the document, it's simply providing suggestions that are later deliberated on in public meetings. And then each subcommittee also has tasks continuing to reach out to prospective town hall partners if you're on the community engagement events subcommittee, and coordinating with your colleagues and staff to collaboratively plan those town halls. And then for the subcommittee on research to continue both document-based research and reaching out to your focus person, organization, or jurisdiction to get additional details. And more information on that, the subcommittee or full commission co-chairs are sending or have sent. So thank you for that, and we can move on to the thank you slide.
Thank you so very much for this evening. Thank you to all of the members who attended this evening's meetings and for your contributions today. Thank you also to the interpreters supporting access to meetings of the Police Accountability Commission and its subcommittees for all Portlanders. Thank you to our briefer, Christopher, for coming and spending time and thoughts with us. Finally, thank you to the members of the community for attending and contributing your thoughts and questions. You can give advanced public comment prior to future meetings at tinyurl.com/Portland PAC comment. You can sign up for emails on the PAC's work at tinyurl.com/Portland PAC updates. It is now 9:03 and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.